I've enjoyed the quiet this morning. It's appropriate, isn't it? I was driving here to church building this morning and just looking at our crowded roads and realising that for many Australians this day is not much different to any other public holiday that they may get in the year, that it's used generally for their own pleasure and for the other activities that we're involved in. Hasn't always been that way, has it? I can remember a time when I was growing up when Good Friday was sacred. I can remember the first time that a game of AFL football was played on Good Friday, and something inside me said something's wrong with that. But in many ways it's a mark of a world that is moving further and further away from the Christian story and adopting another story completely different to that. But Good Friday is a day where we remember God's story being acted out in the pages of human history. It's a day when we particularly focus on the death of Jesus 2,000 years ago on a Roman cross. It's a day 2,000 years ago, or over 2,000 years ago now, where it represented a particularly ignoble and confusing end to this itinerant preacher that had emerged out of this little town of Nazareth, wandered around in Israel and Greater Israel for 3 years, done all these miracles, surprised people extraordinarily by his teaching, and then he'd been taken and crucified, and his disciples were totally confused by all those events. 3 days later, he was to be raised back to life, and we sit on the other side of that, don't we? But we've got to sit on the Good Friday side of it and recognise the confusion that was felt by his followers as they watched the end of this one that they thought was going to transform everything. They didn't know the transformation was coming at that point, but it did come. Now, one of the things that shifted in their understanding as a result of the resurrection, and we moved to that other side of it, was the understanding of how the cross of Jesus would impact upon justice. And that's the focus of our talk today, the cross and how that impacts upon justice in our world. And I trust that as I share this talk with you, we'll see again in a fresh way the relevance of Good Friday, the relevance again of the Christian story as it speaks into the world as it currently is unfolding and unravelling around us. I want to begin by showing you a short clip that was screened on the ABC several weeks ago now. It's a video clip of President Putin visiting the Russian-occupied city of Mariupol a day after being accused by the International Criminal Court of war crimes. And Putin's trip to Mariupol took place in darkness. Unlike President Zelensky, has made a number of trips to the battlefield, Putin has largely remained ensconced in the Kremlin while running what he calls a special military operation in Ukraine. But in this instance, he left that abode, he left the Kremlin to arrive in Mariupol under the cover of darkness. He came in a helicopter, drove himself around the town for a period of time, and then returned back to Russia. And I just want to show you the clip as it appears on the ABC.
President Vladimir Putin touring Mariupol, according to vision broadcast by Russian state television. Driving himself around the occupied city, levelled by Russian forces at the start of the war. His deputy prime minister tells him, "The centre is very beautiful. What you don't see in this footage is any of the devastation. 90% of the city's buildings were destroyed. The ruins of the maternity hospital that was one of the first alleged war crimes. The bombed theatre where hundreds were killed as families with children sought sanctuary. This is the city where Ukrainian fighters and civilians held out for almost 3 months at the Azovstal steel plant, became a symbol of the country's resistance. Now Vladimir Putin is shown a newly built playground and apartment buildings. Only days ago, the International Criminal Court issued him with an arrest warrant for deporting hundreds of Ukrainian children to Russia.
Like all Ukrainians, I feel that today a war criminal whose name is Vladimir Putin visited the scene of a crime he committed for several months.
In In the darkness, some allegedly rehoused residents were shown greeting the Russian president. He went inside to see one of their new apartments and visited a theatre that has been rebuilt. A show of defiance ahead of the visit to Moscow by China's President Xi Jinping. Steve Kinane, ABC News.
There's some delightful or tragic, really, ironies that took place in this whole trip if you think through them deeply enough. His trip took place in darkness so that the Russian state television cameras weren't able to see the devastation that existed outside of the areas that he was visiting. So what the viewers didn't see, which the ABC News clip reveals, is a city that had been bombed to rubble. Before the war, Mariupol had a population of 500,000 people. At this point in time, it's down to about 100,000 who are living in all kinds of desperate circumstances. What the Russians didn't see is the rows and rows of shattered and hollowed out buildings, like in the picture that you can see up there. What they saw instead is the state media visiting a new residential neighbourhood that had been built by the Russian military with the first people moving in last September. What they do see is Putin greeting a small handful of residents and asking them, "Do you live here? Do you like it?" And what they do hear is one of the ladies responding with, "Very much. It's a little piece of heaven that we have here now." And she thanks Putin at that point for his victory. Now, what they don't see is a bombed out maternity ward and hospital and a theatre where hundreds of women and children were killed by Russian bombs. And what they hear instead is the Russian Deputy Prime Minister saying, "We want to finish reconstruction of the centre by the end of the year, at least the facade part. The centre is very beautiful." So having destroyed the city, they now talk about reconstructing at least the facade part. It's just a tragic irony in so many ways, isn't it? And in the words of an advisor of the Ukraine president, he says, as the civilised world announces the arrest of the war director Putin, it's not his arrest, but that the crimes, the murder of thousands of Mariupol families come to admire the ruins of the city and the graves. The UN estimates now that at least 8,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, but other estimates are that it could be as high as 100,000 when the cities are finally liberated and they're able to get in and actually find all the mass graves that have actually been built into the soil of Ukraine. When you consider the tragedy that's unfolding in the Ukraine and the irony of Putin's so-called rebuilding in the midst of what he has destroyed, there is something inside us that says that's just so wrong. There's something inside us that says that's an injustice that's crying out for correction. As you watch a mother weeping over the grave of her son, you say to yourself, surely justice must be done. Surely this must be corrected. But what does it mean for justice to be done, and how does it relate to the cross of Jesus and to Good Friday? Well, that's really what I want to talk to you about this morning. I want to suggest that justice relies on three things. Justice relies on three things, and at the end I'll show you how that relates to the cross and to Good Friday. I'm going to give you these three things as three individual words. So if you're taking notes there, you've got your main headings for those notes. The first thing that justice requires is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The first step in justice is the acknowledgement of wrongdoing by the perpetuator of the injustice. It's the acknowledgement of wrongdoing by the person concerned. The first step in justice is admitting that they have done something wrong. They take responsibility for that. Our greatest example, or greatest modern example of this acknowledgement of wrongdoing is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established at the end of apartheid in South Africa. It continues to stand in modern history as a striking example of how justice could be done in the circumstances that the South Africans found themselves. When the post-apartheid constitution was being negotiated in 1993, the outgoing white regime wanted a blanket of forgiveness or amnesty for all the offences committed by the white government and its officials. They just wanted a blanket amnesty for everybody involved. And Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress would have none of that. They said, no, that won't be just. And so in order to avert a civil war and make a peaceful transition, a compromise was reached. The agreement was that amnesty would be granted only on a case-by-case basis in response to full disclosure by each person concerned. So each person that was accused of some crime would come before the commission, and in the event of full disclosure of wrongdoing, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, they were then given amnesty, a relief from prosecution. Now, as a result of this compromise, the commission was appointed by Mandela in 1995 with Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu as the chairman of the commission. And the hearings themselves were often harrowing in the extreme. White officials testified, sometimes in gruesome detail, and often defiantly, without remorse, about the tortures and deaths that they had perpetuated and caused. And during the testimony, the families of the victims were frequently present, and the survivors testified about their sufferings in the presence of their tormentors. And in return, as I said before, for full disclosure of wrongdoing, the perpetrators received amnesty. That means that they were given freedom from prosecution thereafter. In January 1998, when Tutu was in New York for cancer treatment, he explained the work of the committee in this way. This is what he said. He said, "We recognise the past can't be remade through punishment." You see that? The past can't be remade through punishment. Instead, since we know memories will persist for a long time, we aim to acknowledge those memories. This is critical if we're to build a democracy of self-respecting citizens. As a victim of injustice and oppression, you lose your sense of worth as a person, your dignity. Restorative justice is focused on restoring the personhood that is damaged or lost. But restoring that sense of self means restoring memory, a recognition that what happened to you happened. You are not crazy. Something seriously evil happened to you, and the nation believes you. So imperfect though the process was, Tutu's meticulous adherence to this principle of acknowledgement was a reminder to everyone in the country that while South Africa was determined to seek reconciliation and move on into the future, the justice in that process had not been abandoned. That acknowledgement of wrongdoing was a part of justice, and it was a precondition from being set free from prosecution. Now, one of the greatest problems in Putin being accused of war crimes by the International Criminal Court is that it's very likely that he'll never acknowledge personal wrongdoing, and it's highly likely that he will never be held to account for it. There are two reasons why that's likely. First, Russia doesn't recognise the authority of the International Criminal Court, so they just reject that completely. And secondly, as long as he stays in Russia or in friendly countries, there is no risk of him being arrested and held for war crimes. So to the thousands of grieving families in the Ukraine, the likelihood of Putin ever facing justice is highly unlikely. That's unless you believe in an eternally living and watching God who will one day hold everyone, including President Putin, accountable and responsible for their actions. The moment we understand that there's a God like that who exists and is watching and abides for eternity, that changes everything. Everything. And this is the kind of God we find in the Bible, and it teaches us three things about God and justice. When you read your Bible, you'll find three things there very strongly come out in terms of justice. The first thing we find there is that God hates injustice. This God of ours hates injustice. And you cannot read the Bible without being continually reminded that God hates wrongdoing and injustice. Moses reminded the people of Israel of this just before they were entering into the land of Canaan. So he stands there preaching just as they are about to move across the river and into the land of Canaan. And this is what he says to them in Deuteronomy 10. For the Lord your God is a God of gods and the Lord of lords, who is not partial and takes no bribe. This God can't be bribed. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, yourselves, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So Moses is saying God defends the homeless, the marginalised, the vulnerable, and the refugees of our world. God watches over them, and he calls us to do the same and to stand with them against the injustice they experience in this world. So that's the first thing we learn, that God hates injustice. Secondly, we learn that God's wrath is poured out against injustice. God is angry towards injustice. The idea of an angry God troubles some people, but we need to recognise that God's anger is pure. It's a very pure anger. God's anger is not an emotion that flares haphazardly as if he's subject to temper tantrums. That's not the kind of anger we're talking about here. No, God's wrath is a fierce anger that's carefully directed at all wrongdoing and all injustice that would destroy human lives and destroy human flourishing. That's where God's anger is directed. That's where his wrath is directed. This is the wrath that hears the cries of the oppressed, takes note of the tears of the abused, and takes account of the cruelty of the oppressor and sets himself against it. That's the kind of wrathful God that we have. So that's the second thing we learn, that God's wrath is poured out against injustice. And then lastly, God will one day correct all injustice. For anyone who has suffered great wrong, it's important to know, as Revelation 21 promises, that one day God says every wrong will be put right. He will see to it. And this putting all things right means that all of the situations that are not put right in this life will be put right in the next. If Putin is not held to account in this life, then God will hold him to account in the next. There are many abusers in our world that have never been confronted with the criminality of their abuse. In the next life they will be. God will make sure of that. In many spheres of life, human justice is never done, but the assurance of the Bible is that that's only temporary. One day that's going to change. One day the God of the universe is going to confront them. So this is what the Bible teaches us about God. He hates injustice. His wrath is poured out against it, and one day he will right and correct all injustice. Many Western people are sort of repelled by the idea that God could be a God of wrath. We love the idea that God is a God of love. We don't like so much the idea that God can be seen as a God of wrath or of anger. Many Western people would think that's a repugnant idea. How can God be wrathful? Well, Miroslav Volf is a Croatian theologian who witnessed the consequences of the ethnic cleansing that occurred during the Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s, has a very different view to that. He says the idea of an all-loving, non-wrathful God is quite acceptable if you're living in a quiet suburban home in America where you've got the police and the military taking care of your protection. But he says you try and take that message into a war-torn country like Yugoslavia. He says, imagine you were trying to deliver that message in a war zone. He says, you're delivering it among your listeners, and among them are people whose cities and villages have been first plundered, then burned and levelled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit. He said, try and take that message that God is just a God of love who has no concern about wrath and judgment. Take that message into the war-torn areas of Yugoslavia, and he said it will be totally unbelievable. He says only in this context, only in the context of a serene suburban neighbourhood is the idea of a loving God who won't hold people to account acceptable. You need a war area to understand the need of a wrathful God. Only the notion that God is a God of justice who will one day repay all for things that they do wrong will work and hold in a military zone. It's the only thing, incidentally, Volf goes on to say, that will stop this perpetual cycle of revenge. It's only, the father and son that's seen his wife murdered or his sister raped. It's only when they recognise that God himself will one day hold that person to account that they are given the mechanism by which to not take their own vengeance on that particular individual and to stop the cycle of revenge and response that way. So a home or country where love prevails is also dependent, ironically, upon a wrathful God who will one day judge. That's the only context in which we can actually find a nation of love becoming a reality. It's when we have a God who is not only loving but also wrathful against injustice. And this is the God that will one day force us all to acknowledge wrongdoing and will force all to be held account for what they do in this life. So the first thing we learn about justice is the need of acknowledgement. The second is the need of restitution. We need, if justice is to be done, we need firstly for the crime to be acknowledged, but then secondly we need for restitution to be done, restitution to be made. By restitution we mean the restoration of property or rights that have been previously taken away, or the restoration to the former or original state of something as it was. Now, three things I want to say about restitution. Firstly, this idea that justice requires restitution is something we intuitively feel. We intuitively go that direction in the place of injustice. As I've watched the war in Ukraine unfolding, I've been appalled at the devastation that's been taking place with regards to the different cities and villages. Mariupol, which we looked at before, has been one of the worst. And the city has almost been obliterated. It's completely reduced to rubble. But other towns and villages have also been wiped from the map. And as you look at that devastation, you ask yourself, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to rebuild and pay for the rebuilding of these houses that have been destroyed, these homes that have been wiped off the map? Who's going to pay for that? If the Russians don't pay for it, who's going to pay for it? How are they going to be held to account for this devastation they brought upon the nation of Ukraine? You see, instinctively we feel that it's not right that something should be destroyed and no one held to account for destroying it. We instinctively feel that's not just. Surely Putin should be held responsible, but how do we enact repayment from him? And you see this same instinct that restitution is appropriate to justice. We find it, or you hear it echoed in murder cases where the families of the victims comment later on the sentence that has been passed. And so often you hear things like, he got 20 years, but we've got a life sentence without the family member. And as they make that comment, you sense with them the injustice of that, situation. They're right in many ways of how fair is it that the whole life has been taken and this individual just pays for it with a small portion of their own. It's our first point about restitution and justice. We intuitively feel that it's needed for justice to take place. But secondly, we practically don't deliver on it. We don't deliver on this idea that restitution so often is necessary for justice to take place. I find it interesting that in our Western systems, normally our justice takes the form of punishment rather than restitution. You ever thought about it that way? You know, if someone does something wrong, we punish them. We put them into prison. We do something to punish them. But we don't think in terms of restitution, correction of the wrong that's been done. So our kids assault people, kids rob stores, they burn down schools, etc. But rather than forcing them to make restitution, we opt for punishment by putting them into youth detention centres or whatever. This issue has become particularly prominent recently in the Western Australian government's review of the Banksia Hill Youth Detention Centre. I don't know how many of you followed that story a few months ago. The review was launched amid reports of self-harm, suicide attempts and the destruction of the cells in the youth detention centre by the kids. And the finding is that a review that took place about 18 months ago was, and I quote, that the government should increasingly move away from punitive to control to therapeutic care. All right? So move away from punitive control, punishment, to therapeutic care. Now, while the issues are extraordinarily complex, and it's true that many of these children are dealing with serious mental health issues, the problem with the language of therapeutic care is that it seems to overlook the fact that these children also have done something seriously wrong. They've actually done something wrong. And so while therapeutic care may be necessary for some kids, and I think it's highly appropriate for many of them, the reality is that restitution for wrongdoing would be a more appropriate means to deal with the issue than therapeutic care in some ways. You know, a child has burned down a school. Then just don't punish them. Make restitution. Get the child to help in the rebuilding of the school. A child has robbed a store or abused somebody. Well, then get them to make restitution. You see, that's the biblical form of justice. Is just not punitive care or punitive control, but restoration, restitution. That's what God looks for, and that's what justice instinctively looks for. But strangely, for some reason in our Western system, we opt for punishment rather than restitution. So there's our second point. While we instinctively feel it, we practically don't deliver on it. And third, while we instinctively feel it, we practically can't deliver it. Okay? We don't do it, but practically in many instances we can't deliver it. In May 2012, let me explain that. In May 2012, Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, and who was also a powerful leader, rebel leader himself, was sentenced to 50 years in prison for his role in the atrocities committed in the Sierra Leone during its civil war in the 1990s. And in that particular civil war, literally tens of thousands of innocent people were killed or had limbs or noses amputated. I mean, some of the atrocities were just dreadful to think and read about. In sentencing Charles Taylor, the judge, Richard Lussick, found him guilty of, and I quote, aiding and abetting as well as planning some of the most heinous and brutal crimes recorded in human history. And yet, even though justice had been done, the chief prosecutor noted at the press conference afterward that, and I quote, the sentence today does not replace amputated limbs. It does not bring back those who were murdered. It does not heal the wounds of those who were raped or forced to become sexual slaves. You see, human systems of justice are crucial to the functioning of a society, but they can only do so much. In most instances, human justice cannot make right wrong. It cannot correct the injustice that took place. Think back on your own life, think back on mine, and think of some of the things that you've done that have hurt others. And you may have acknowledged to them the wrongdoing, and you may have been full of regret at what you've done. But sometimes the consequences of your actions can never actually be fully corrected. They continue, the consequences continue. In many instances, the damage was done and there's nothing you can do to correct that damage. We long to change it, but it just is. I look back sometimes at some of the things I've said to people and some of the things I've done, and I just internally and externally groan sometimes. I wish I could change it, but I can't. I just know it exists and it continues to exist. I've said sorry, but the consequence remains. And the result for many of us is we live with crippling guilt and shame, and that sometimes brings all sorts of mental illness for people as they try and cope with the guilt of what they've done that they can't be washed away. So there's our second point, the need of restitution. We all instinctively feel that restitution is owed to victims of injustice, but the deeper problem is that we don't, and in many cases can't, deliver on restitution. Sins done in the past simply can't be atoned for. And that brings us to our third and final point when it comes to justice and God's view of justice, and that is substitution. It's interesting, the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, has a lot to say about justice. And what we need to understand clearly about the Old Testament particularly, and it's true of the New Testament as well, is that God's justice is always directed towards restoration, not merely condemnation. All right? God's form of justice is particularly focused upon restoration and renewal, not mere condemnation. In other words, God's justice is always directed towards restoring a situation, not merely condemning it. We're too good sometimes at condemning people and too slow sometimes to move to the next step of lifting them up, of restoring them. God condemns injustice not just because it's wrong, but also because of the impact that it has on human flourishing, the damage it does to people's lives. God hates injustice not because of how it hurts people, but also because of the way it stops them attaining life, stops them a way of attaining human flourishing. I want you to notice this alternation between condemning injustice and urging life in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. We see there where God is talking to the nation of Israel. He says, "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." You see how God's justice is moving backwards and forwards between condemning the wrongdoing, but then pleading for the restoration. And that's how God's justice is. It's always given in the context of restoration. And interestingly, that was one of the principles that guided Desmond Tutu in his work in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was committed to restoration, not merely condemnation. God's justice, he insisted, is never merely condemnation, but it's always restorative. And so that is how the commission has to act. And that's why he was such a godsend to the nation. That's why so much of his work stands as a beacon of hope in our world. It's because he was committed to God's form of justice, which was restoration, not merely condemnation. Michael Ignatieff was a non-religious writer. He wasn't a Christian, but he was also reflecting on Desmond Tutu's observations as he watched this Truth Commission in action. And he says this, he says, "Watching a society struggle with the dilemma of amnesty changes what one thinks about justice. It is associated with punishment, with putting people behind bars, but it can also mean something else: truth and moral reparation, the re-stitching together of a moral world." Now, this re-stitching together of a moral world is what the cross and Good Friday is all about. That's what God is doing through the cross. He's re-stitching our world together. That's where his heart is, you see. That's what God is looking for when he looks for justice. Good Friday is about God doing something that we cannot do. Good Friday is about God making substitution for the injustices that we have imposed upon others, that we can't correct, but that he is in the process of correcting. There's two problems when we think about the provision of restitution. The first problem is when the form of payment can never be appropriate to the crime or the injustice. That's our first problem when we talk about restitution, is when the form of payment can never be appropriate to the injustice. I mean, what form of payment could Putin make for the tens of thousands of lives that have been lost and for the homes and cities that have been destroyed? I mean, what form of payment could he make? But think back to the Abdullah family and the 3 children and a cousin that were killed by a drink driver in February 2 years ago. I don't think any of us will forget the picture of the grief-stricken mother at the crash site the next morning, where 3 of her kids died. At the time of the crash, the driver's parents, retired Detective Alan Davidson and his wife Kay, said that their son, the drunk driver, had a good heart, and he was heartbroken over the incident. And originally Davidson was sentenced to 28 years in jail with a non-parole period of 21 years. But in July last year, 6 months ago, that was reduced to a maximum of 20 years with a non-parole period of 15 years. So potentially he's going to walk out of prison in 15 years. And we ask ourselves, no matter how deeply sorry he is, how is the payment of 15 years of his life equated to the loss of 4 little children's lives and the pain their parents experience? So that's the first problem when we think of restoration is, when the form of payment can never be appropriate to the crime of injustice. But our second problem is when that payment is never made. The situation where a woman is abused, but her abuser is never called to account for the abuse. Or when we have wars where totalitarian dictators like Putin are never held accountable for the untold suffering that they've caused to millions of people. How will justice be done in their case? How will retribution be made or restitution be made for their suffering? Well, the Bible's answer is that the death of the Son of God on the cross 2,000 years ago is somehow adequate as payment. That's the amazing thing about the cross. And we have multiple verses that teach us this. The verses like 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18, for Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. Or 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. See, God's answer to the world's sin is the life of his Son. That's the payment. And because he was the infinite Son of God, then the value of that death somehow is surpassing value that's adequate, in a sense, to repay the injustices that has been done. God's answer to the world's sin is the life of his Son, and that's what Good Friday is all about. Good Friday is all about God absorbing the violence and oppression of others in order that the cycle of violence should stop with him. Someone has to pay. And on Good Friday, Jesus, the Son of God, paid. It's all about God restoring right in our world so both the oppressor and the oppressed can have peace. And that's the amazing thing about it. It's because of the cross, it's because of Good Friday, that ultimately both the Abdullah family and Samuel Davidson, who killed their 3 children, can both live with peace. It's because the one payment of Jesus is adequate for both the oppressor and for the oppressed. It works both ways. And that's the way God has dealt with injustice in our world. Let me just conclude. In his very pessimistic book, I couldn't read it because it's in German. Jared might be able to do this, but in his very pessimistic book, which is roughly translated into English as Prospects for Civil War, the German writer Hans Enzensberger begins by explaining why the prospects for war are so much better than the prospects for peace. He says, animals fight, but they do not wage wars. He said humans are the only primates who pursue enthusiastically mass killing of their own kind in a planned way. War belongs to the most important human inventions, the oldest traditions of humanity. Its myths and epic poetry speak primarily of killings. Now, he ends his book, intriguingly, by reminding his readers of Sisyphus. That's the tragic figure of Greek mythology who was condemned to keep pushing the big boulder up the hill. So he pushes it up the hill and then it rolls down, and then he has to push it back up again, and it rolls down, pushes it back up and rolls down. That's the Greek myth. And what Enzensberger says, he says, that stone, he says, is peace in our world. It's continually, we push it up and it rolls down. We push it up and it rolls down. Prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Western world had been lulled into a false sense of security about war and our ability to go to war with one another. That illusion has now been shattered, really, and the true reality of a planet where war is amongst the normality is suddenly brought back again to Western nations. In the cross of Jesus, God has experienced the grossest possible injustice. And in Christ on the cross, God has been joined with all those in our world who experienced injustice and brutality. And the extreme nature of the most brutal execution the world has ever devised, God has joined with those who know the worst that the world can produce. That's what happened on Good Friday. God joined with us in the worst that we could do. He's done that so we can finally end the violence that we can't end. In the words of the Apostle Paul on the cross, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And that's what Good Friday is all about, God bringing the justice that we can't bring. And that's why we're here today, and that's why it's so important that we're here today, because we remind ourselves of that amazing reality that God has done something that we can't do. He's bringing something that we can't bring. And as his people, we worship him for that today, don't we? Let me pray, and then we're going to sing our final song together. Our Father, we're humbled as we sit here today, reminding ourselves of the fact that we live in a world that's filled with war and violence. And it's a world that put your son to death in the most extreme and brutal way possible. And Father, you allowed it. You allowed it so that you could join with us in the worst of our suffering and say to us, I understand, when we complain about it. And so we thank you, Father, that you've gone places that many of us will never go. And you call us to live in the light of the hope that is ours because of Jesus and because of Good Friday. And so we give you our thanks for this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to sing a final song, Hope as a Name. I think it's nothing better that we could finish with